When we talk about domestic violence, there are two kinds of domestic violence. One is effect on the body and the effect on mind. So, effect on body and effect on mind can be studied separately, but mostly it happens together. So, when there is an impact on the body, it affects psychologically. When there is an impact on the mind, it affects health of the victim. So, it is only for this purpose of study we classify them into two, but they do not occur separately, they occur together. So, physical impact. The physical impact would be a physical abuse of the victim, where the serious impairment of organ or faculty can exist. Feeling embarrassed to go to doctor because it is a result of domestic violence, protection of relationship is the paramount consideration. Now, going to doctor, treating that ailment would lead to advertising or propagating the issues which are happening within the four walls of the house. So, they feel embarrassed to go out and get it treated. That leads to physical and mental deterioration. So, health, physical as well as mental, gets deteriorated. Then there is a gradual effect on the victim. Finally, it leads to psychological damage and it may also lead to death. So, therefore, physical damage finally leads to psychological damage and sometimes it may lead to death. All types of violence leads to certain kinds of feelings, like feeling of rejection, feeling of anxiety, feeling of being unwanted, the fear that this what has happened today might be repeated tomorrow. These unpleasant experiences can happen again and again. This would result into phobia. This is psychological impact on the victim. It might lead to depression and victim lose faith in the sanctity of relationship. Now, this is a final impact of psychological problem. So, once she loses the sanctity of relationship, she wouldn't be in a position to establish a new relationship. She cannot nurture any new relationship. So, it leads to lowered self-esteem. The extreme result would be unnecessary reaction to the situation, becoming overly aggressive and poor performance at workplace. Now, these are all the result of psychological impact. So, what I have understood and what I have tried to impress upon you is that domestic violence is not about slapping a person. Domestic violence is much bigger problem than this. This issue was recognized by international community, and as a result there were many international instruments passed by the United Nations organization. In the year 1979, there was a convention on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and in 1993 there was a declaration on elimination of violence against women. So, international community is doing its bit to overcome these problems. But where we stand, India, the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005, this is the law which passed in the present century, which protects women from domestic violence. It would be wrong to say that that was the first attempt to save or protect women from domestic violence, because there were series of attempts made, and it is also important to note that most of these attempts have failed achieving its expected result. So, if you take up the steps taken after independence or before independence, if you could add that Sati System Abolition Act and other acts as the acts to protect women against domestic violence, then there were attempts before independence also. The major step after independence was the Dowry Prohibition Act. Then there was a criminal law amendments made in 83. There were a series of amendments made, and there was a major reason for that of Mathura case and etc. Then the Dowry Prohibition Act did its bit, but mostly it failed to curtail the dowry problem. Criminal law amendments, yes, they served to some extent, they provided benefits to some extent, but finally Domestic Violence Act 2005 was brought into force to counter all these issues relating to domestic violence. So, now when we talk about Domestic Violence Act 2005, first let us look into the complaint procedure. See, when we talk about victims of domestic violence, you should also realize that the victims of domestic violence won't be in a position to approach any of the authorities mentioned under the act, as well as any of the authorities which are available under any of our legal system. So, therefore, to make the law effective, one interesting development is brought in, that is, aggrieved woman can approach the authorities under the act, but not only aggrieved woman, any person, it may be he or she may be a relative of the victim, neighbor, or even a social worker can file a complaint on behalf of this victim. So, women suffering domestic violence, her issues could be raised with the government by anybody. Now, this is actually a departure from the concept of locus standi, where only the victim of a crime should approach the police. Here anybody can approach the police. So, this development definitely going to help the victims to a very large extent. So, anybody can file a complaint. So, we have a list of victims, that is spouse, child, parent, or person living in a relationship. So, these victims issues could be raised by any person, that is the victim herself, or it can be relatives, or even it can be a social worker. But against whom the case is going to be filed? It is going to be filed against adult male member who is living or who has had domestic relationship with the aggrieved woman. So, present domestic relationship, past domestic relationship creates eligibility against the adult male to be an accused under this provision. Again, I want to make some clarification here. I may use the term crime accused, but Domestic Violence Act provides civil remedies, not the criminal remedies. So, the relatives of the husband, male partner can also be included under these provisions. So, the issue is, what is this domestic relationship? Living in, or who was lived in domestic relationship. So, when you try to look into the definition of domestic relationship, it says a relationship between two persons who are living or have any time lived together in a shared household. Again, a very broad meaning has been granted. So, any two people living in a shared household becomes a people living in a domestic relationship. So, now let us continue our research to find out what is this shared household. Now, shared household is a household where aggrieved woman has lived or living along with the respondent, which might be owned by her, rented, or belonging to a joint family. So, as far as the place of residence is concerned, the ownership or rental or whatever it may be, it is immaterial. Whether the aggrieved woman or the respondent has a right over it or not. What is issue here is whether they lived under one common roof, that becomes a shared household. When they live in a shared household, they live in a domestic relationship. When they live in a domestic relationship, they are subjected to Domestic Violence Act.